Your attention, it's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Rose Cairns, who's a research fellow at SPRU from the University of Sussex, and she's going to be talking about her work on expert framing of geoengineering.
So this was an early piece of work I did with the Climate Geoengineering Governance Project, and essentially what we started out with looking at is the variety of ways in which out there in public discourse and in expert discourse people are talking about, thinking about, constructing what geoengineering is, what it might be, and what it might imply now or in the future for humanity and the environment. And it's very much, as I think we're probably all aware, a contested construct. So there's a variety of different kinds of framings out there, from ones that we've heard today about a climatic emergency, only immediate drastic action can save us from this catastrophe. Ideas about inevitability, it's just a question of time when these things are going to happen. Other ideas about maybe we don't have the luxury of waiting for an attitude change. Or different kinds of metaphors like geoengineering being like chemotherapy. Or on the other hand, the idea that geoengineering actually is very undemocratic, or that there's a kind of illusory idea that you could find a technological answer to some of these very complex social problems. And there are a whole range of other different kinds of a bewildering array of different kinds of framing devices that are already out there in public discourse. The ambiguity of the term is well recognized. So it's subject to what I think Steve has referred to as kind of definitional politics. There is no one scientific answer to the question, what is geoengineering? At what point, for example, do particular forestry practices or the idea of burying biochar, does that become geoengineering? Are other interventions, such as the release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, could they be classed as geoengineering? Or the cumulative impact, for example, of weather modification? Now, our starting point with this piece of research is that the answer to these kinds of questions isn't actually scientific. There is no one scientific definition of geoengineering. The answer to these kinds of questions are matters for social and political contestation. And there are, in fact, a variety of different possible ways that you could look at what geoengineering is. For our purposes, we didn't see this kind of ambiguity and multivalence of the term geoengineering as a problem, more as a site for an interesting way in to looking at the variety of different kind of social, political and ethical positions within which these debates are emerging. So with regard to, for example, the nature of the climate change problem, ideas about the role of scientific research and technological development in helping or indeed causing some problems, different kinds of ethics and so on. So our way of thinking about geoengineering, as I think Steve mentioned, was as a kind of technological imaginary. And our approach to looking at it in this particular piece of research was a method called Q. And we used a variety of these kinds of statements and many others, which came from academic papers as well as more popular media sites, websites, comments on weblogs and so on, to create a concourse of opinion statements about geoengineering. We then, in a process whereby we looked to the concourse of statements and we used thematic analysis to select 48 statements that in some way, in a kind of miniature set, represented the diversity of views in this broader array of statements as a kind of test in order to administer to a set of participants. Now, I should stress that this wasn't a kind of public engagement exercise, and neither actually was it necessarily just expert opinion. These participants were self-selected people who were involved in the geoengineering discourse. So we're looking here at people who are actively framing these debates. So arguably these are the debates within which public opinion will form in the future. The way that Q works is you have a sorting grid that looks like this, and you are asked to sort from most like to least like your point of view into this forced distribution. It's important to note that this is a relative scale rather than absolute, so it's possible that you might have agreed with all of the statements that I was presenting you with. You should, in theory, still be able to rank order them from most to least like your point of view. This is just a list of the various participating organisations. As you can see, it was largely people at universities, academic institutions. Simple fact that the discourse is often being generated within academic papers. Did get some industry representatives, and I think I've seen a couple here today also. We also looked out to the various NGOs that are active in this debate, namely obviously ETC Group being the primary NGO who's been campaigning on this issue, and others. As I mentioned before, the primary focus was the UK, but I did also put an online tool out there, and we had various responses from the US, Canada, and Japan. So what you do with the Q study is you look at the way in which your respondents sort these particular cards, you statistically analyse them and look for patterns or shared framings of the topic at hand. In this case, I did a principal components analysis followed by a Varimax procedure, which resulted in 3 patterns, or we call them factors, of ways of thinking about geoengineering. One of these, however, was what they call a bipolar factor. So this meant that actually respondents sorted the cards in nearly exactly the opposite way from one another. So one person's exactly like my point of view is another person's exactly, well, least like my point of view card. So we split this into 2 polar opposite viewpoints. So the viewpoints that emerged were the following. So I will run through them very quickly. There was a viewpoint which I've simply called it, the names that I've given them are a sort of abbreviated storyline. These were taken from some of the opinion cards, which were sorted particularly highly for that particular point of view. So this group of people I've called We Are the Planetary Maintenance Engineers, because that's how they self-identified in the statements. For this group of people, the context of a planetary emergency is very real. There is an immediate need for geoengineering. From this point of view, the risks of geoengineering research are much less than those of not doing it. We need to have this research. Commercial involvement, or in fact anything that might help to push research forward, is considered a very positive thing. And moratoriums obviously are hence a negative idea. And this point of view broadly considers humanity to be, whether we like it or not, we have now taking on this idea of being planetary maintenance engineers. The point of view that was polar opposite to this point of view considered geoengineering, rather than being a set of technologies or ideas about how we might manipulate the climate, this one very much drew out the idea of geoengineering being a political project. So it's about, from the people that sorted the cards in this particular way, it's a kind of strategy aimed at maintaining the political and economic status quo. From this point of view, again, the idea that geoengineering is fundamentally undemocratic. It's likely to lead to irreversible damage being done to major Earth systems. This point of view crucially also highlighted the idea that research isn't really neutral, that research builds up a certain momentum in a particular direction, and calls for a moratorium on activities outside the laboratory, and sees commercial involvement as unacceptable. So you can kind of see this polarization within the debate. However, there were these 2 other views, which weren't necessarily defined purely along this spectrum, but had other dimensions of difference to them. So at the very least, we need more research. The idea from this point of view is that research is crucial. We can't really talk about what we think about geoengineering until we've done more research. There was a very clear definition here between research and deployment. People who loaded on this point of view found it actually quite difficult to carry out the exercise. Often the response being that the ambiguity in the term was very unhelpful. It was very difficult to place cards that were about geoengineering kind of in general. And respondents would much prefer to talk about particular technologies, and instead repeated, we need to judge technologies on their merits and risks rather than talking about geoengineering in general. There was a distinct effort within this particular group of people to move away from the emergency framing, which was felt to be unhelpful. And public debate was an important part here as well. A final framing that I've simply called Let's Focus on Carbon was defined by the idea that essentially we may need some kinds of geoengineering, or at least new kinds of technology to deal with climate change, but this technology won't solve the problem on its own. And specifically, there was a distinction here between types of geoengineering that might focus on solar radiation management and those focusing on carbon. And the feeling here was that the climate is simply too complex to be controlled, and we should therefore be focusing all of our energies, including research, on those that might be able to remove carbon from the air, well, just focusing on carbon in general, including mitigation. Specifically from this point of view, what I thought was quite interesting was that the term itself was felt to be quite useful. So there was talk about the fact that potentially we've reached a form of lock-in within climate change discussions, that actually that geoengineering might be open up a useful space in which to have other kinds of discussions. So these were the 4 views that came up, and these, apologies, you won't be able to read these numbers, but these represent the various people who took part in the study, and these are the number of people who were clustered together in these particular groupings. But as you can see, there were also this group down here whose views were correlated with more than one factor. And it's relatively normal within a Q study that you would expect to have this group of people who aren't purely defined by these groupings. Within this particular study, this is quite a large number, and this may be a fact of that was quite difficult for people to sort the cards because of the ambiguity of the term geoengineering, or the difficulty of not separating it out into different technologies, or simply feeling ambivalent about these particular framings that I've represented here. So one way of looking at this as well is to map this out into 3-dimensional space. So when you do that, you can see the way in which these, each individual little blob here is a person. So you can see quite clearly when I look at the plot from this direction, obviously the color-coded ones are the ones who loaded only on this particular viewpoint, and all of those blobs in between illustrate that this is quite a messy picture that I'm describing here. But you can see that there is quite a lot of bipolarity in the plot. So a lot of these different views can be described according to where they fall on this line from the planetary maintenance engineering point of view, which is quite a kind of technocratic view about the possibilities for technology controlling the climate, through down on the other side to the idea of the kind of political dimensions of geoengineering being the more significant and salient aspects of the debate. However, as I've mentioned, this isn't the only dimension of difference, and you can see that there is a degree of difference which can be accounted for by looking at where people lie on this axis about whether or not we should be focusing purely on carbon, or the degree to which people felt that more research is what we need. As you'll notice, these weren't bipolar, these discourses, so there's no one down in the bottom corner right there who felt that neither research nor carbon were an important part of this debate, which is comforting, I suppose. So, in conclusion, there are a diversity of framings of geoengineering out there, and within them there are a diversity of actors. And we can see this kind of as discourse coalitions linking otherwise disparate actors and networks through shared narratives. As I mentioned, that some people suggested that geoengineering might be useful, and even in all its ambiguity, that it facilitates this coalition-forming process, allowing actors with otherwise little in common to speak the same language. And while in some contexts, and I think Catherine after me is going to be talking about the legal context, obviously ambiguity can be quite unhelpful. It probably is the case at a broader societal level that it is in many ways unavoidable, that we're not actually, even if we get ever greater precision in our language, or if we talk very particularly about technologies, we're not going to reduce the diversity of positions and framings with regard to this topic. And that is simply because the diversity of views isn't an artifact of a lack of data or a lack of information about these technologies. It's rather based on a plurality of different political, ethical, and cultural positions, which is a reminder, which I'm sure we're all aware, but it is worth remembering, that these are matters that far transcend technical analysis alone. Depending on which framing one takes with regard to these debates, has radically different implications for what you would count of as appropriate expertise, appropriate questions, and appropriate forms of analysis about geoengineering in the future. Finally, there may be some gaps in the results, and this is something that I've been considering personally as well. The question about whether or not, if you consider the whole conversation about geoengineering to be a kind of dangerous distraction from the necessary business of mitigation and adaptation, is it a rational and reasonable kind of strategy to to remove yourself from the debate and remain silent? And therefore, would those people not actually feature on my graph? And is it actually a kind of, as an open question, it's a kind of a dilemma of whether or not one continues to be involved in these debates if you consider it to be a distraction. So if anyone is interested in further information, that paper has been published earlier this year in Global Environmental Change. So thank you.